The hearing room of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs was charged with a palpable electric tension this Tuesday morning. To the uninitiated tourist or casual observer wandering the halls of the Dirksen Senate office building, it might have looked like just another routine day on Capitol Hill. The polished mahogany dais, the hum of air conditioning fighting the heat of television lights, the quiet shuffling of aides carrying binders thick with legislation. The official topic on the docket was immigration fraud and identity document abuse, a dry bureaucratic title that usually resulted in empty seats, bored reporters checking their phones, and C-SPAN cameras panning across a vacant room. But today, the room was standing room only. The press gallery was packed to capacity, photographers were jockeying for position, and the line of spectators snaked down the hallway. Everyone, from the seasoned correspondents to the junior staffers, understood the real focus of today's proceedings. This wasn't about abstract policy or administrative tweaks. This was about Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and the persistent, radioactive questions surrounding her history, her marriages, and the allegations that had followed her like a shadow for years. Sitting at the questioning table was Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. At 72 years old, Kennedy was a master of political theater, a man who understood the power of persona better than perhaps anyone else in Washington. He didn't look like the typical aggressive inquisitor one sees in viral clips. He didn't yell. He didn't pound the table with his fist. He wore a simple, ill-fitting dark suit, nothing flashy, with cheap reading glasses perched precariously on the very end of his nose. In his hands, he held actual paper notes, yellow legal pads scrawled with handwriting and printed documents with highlighted sections, refusing the modern trend of tablets and sleek teleprompters. He carried a single, unassuming manila folder labeled simply Omar. Kennedy had cultivated a persona that was both disarming and dangerous, the simple country lawyer. He spoke with a slow, deliberate Louisiana drawl that sounded like a friendly conversation on a front porch over iced tea. He used folksy metaphors, self-deprecating humor, and a tone of bewildered curiosity. But beneath that, aw shucks. Exterior was a brilliant legal mind sharpened at Oxford University, where he earned a first-class degree, and the University of Virginia Law School. He was a legal shark disguised as a goldfish, a man who knew exactly how to lead a witness into a trap they never saw coming. Opposite him sat Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. At 42, wearing her trademark hijab and a sharp, colorful blazer, she projected an image of practiced defiance. She was surrounded by a phalanx of lawyers and advisors, a visual representation of the defensive wall she had built around her past. She had survived controversies before: anti-Semitic tweets, campaign finance violations, primary challenges, usually by deploying a rehearsed strategy. Deflect, accuse the questioner of racism or Islamophobia, and claim victimhood. She sat with her chin up, ready for a fight. She expected aggression. She expected shouting. She was prepared for a partisan brawl where she could play the martyr. She was not prepared for John Kennedy. The committee chairman called the hearing to order. The gavel banged, a sharp crack that silenced the murmurs in the room. Kennedy adjusted his reading glasses, looking down at his paper notes for a long moment, letting the silence stretch just enough to make the witness uncomfortable. Then he looked up at Omar, with a smile that seemed genuinely warm, almost grandfatherly. "Ms. Omar," Kennedy began, his voice rolling out slowly, emphasizing the vowels in that distinct Southern cadence. "Thank you for being here. I know congressional hearings aren't exactly a fun way to spend a Tuesday morning. so I appreciate your time and your willingness to help us understand some things. His politeness was the first trap. It stripped the tension from the room, making it impossible for Omar to immediately launch into a defense against aggression, because there was none. "Now," Kennedy continued, leaning back in his chair and clasping his hands, "I'm just a simple country lawyer from Louisiana. I went to some fancy schools a long time ago, but I try not to let it go to my head. When I don't understand something, I just ask questions until it makes sense to me. Simple questions. Yes or no questions, when possible. I find that keeps things clear for the folks back home." He opened his manila folder carefully, treating it like it contained family recipes rather than evidence of federal crimes. "You've been a member of Congress since 2019. That's 6 years now. You represent Minnesota's 5th District. You came to America as a refugee from Somalia when you were about 12 or 13 years old. You fled a civil war, spent time in a refugee camp in Kenya, and came here with nothing. You became a United States citizen in 2000, got elected to the state legislature, and then to Congress in 2018. Kennedy paused, looking her in the eye with a look of genuine admiration. "That's the American dream right there, ma'am. Refugee to member of Congress in 1 generation. That is what makes this country special. That opportunity. That mobility." Omar nodded slightly, her guard lowering just a fraction. He was praising her. He was acknowledging her story. Perhaps this wouldn't be the attack she feared. "But," Kennedy said, the transition seamless and gentle, "I've been reading about some questions folks have raised about your background, and I want to be clear. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm not trying to attack you. I'm just trying to understand some things that don't make sense to this old country lawyer. Things that seem complicated." He looked down at his notes again. "And usually, when things are this complicated, it's because someone is trying to hide something simple. So, I want to walk through this with you, step by step, and see if we can clear the air. Because the American people deserve clarity, don't you think?" Omar hesitated, then nodded. "I am happy to answer questions about my record, Senator." Kennedy smiled. "That's good, because I have a few." Kennedy flipped through his notes methodically, the sound of the paper amplifying the silence in the room. He took his time, putting on a pair of reading glasses, peering at a document, then taking them off again. It was theater, designed to show he was meticulous and unhurried. "You've been married 3 times, Kennedy stated as a matter of fact, his tone conversational. "First marriage was to a man named Ahmed Hirsi. That was in 2002, a religious ceremony, not legal. You had 3 children with him. Then, in 2009, you legally married a different man named Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi. Then you divorced Elmi in 2017. Then you legally married Hirsi again in 2018. Then you divorced him in 2019. Now you're married to Tim Minot." He looked up, peering over his spectacles. "That's a lot of marriages, ma'am. A lot of paperwork. But the one that's got folks talking, the one that seems to be the source of all this confusion, is that middle one. Ahmed Elmi." The air in the room shifted instantly. This was the third rail. This was the allegation that had dogged Omar for years, the one her team aggressively suppressed. "Because there is considerable evidence," Kennedy continued, his voice steady and devoid of malice, "suggesting that Mr. Elmi is not just your ex-husband. The evidence suggests he is your brother." Omar stiffened. Her lawyers leaned in, whispering urgently. She glared at Kennedy, her expression hardening into the defiance she was known for. Kennedy held up a hand to stall any interruption. Now, hold on. I've got documents here, school records, family photos, social media posts. But before we get into the weeds of all that paper, there is a simple solution to all this confusion. A solution that doesn't require lawyers or investigations or hearings. A DNA test. Kennedy smiled, spreading his hands. If Ahmed Elmi isn't your brother, a DNA test proves it instantly. Takes 5 minutes. Science doesn't lie. Settles everything. All the questions go away. The media stops asking. I stop asking. He looked at her with genuine curiosity. So, let me ask you, and it's a pretty straightforward question. Yes or no type question. Have you taken a DNA test? The question hung in the air. It was brilliant in its simplicity. It wasn't an accusation. It was an inquiry about an action. It demanded a binary response. Ilhan Omar's response was immediate, practiced, and visceral. She leaned into the microphone, her voice rising in pitch, channeling indignation. Senator Kennedy, she said, this is a racist line of questioning. These are conspiracy theories that have been thoroughly debunked by fact-checkers and media organizations. This line of questioning feeds into Islamophobic and xenophobic narratives designed to attack immigrants and refugees and people of color. I will not dignify these attacks by... Kennedy interrupted her. He didn't shout. He didn't bang the gavel. He just held up his hand gently, palm out, like a crossing guard stopping traffic. Ma'am, he said, his voice soft but firm. With all due respect, I didn't ask about conspiracy theories. I didn't ask about racism. I didn't ask about Islamophobia. I didn't ask what the fact-checkers said. I asked a simple, factual question. Have you taken a DNA test? Yes or no? These allegations have been investigated. Omar tried to pivot again, sticking to her talking points. Ma'am, Kennedy's drawl stretched the word out, turning it into 2 syllables. I'm not asking about investigations. I'm asking about a DNA test. You either have taken one or you haven't. It's like asking if you had breakfast. It's a yes or no. Which is it? Omar shifted in her seat. She looked at her notes. She looked at her lawyer. She couldn't say yes, because she hadn't. To lie would be perjury. She couldn't say no, because that invited the question why. So she chose the third option, defiance. I am not going to dignify these attacks with an answer, she said coldly. Kennedy nodded slowly, a look of dawning understanding washing over his face. He leaned back in his chair. So, that's a no, he said. You have not taken a DNA test. I am not going to participate in... It's not about participating, ma'am, Kennedy said, cutting through her spin. It's about logic. See, here's what I don't understand. If someone accused me of something I didn't do, especially something as serious as marrying my sibling, which is a crime and a moral taboo, and there was a 5-minute test that would prove my innocence beyond any doubt, I'd take that test before they finished asking the question. I'd volunteer for it. I'd insist on it. I'd put the results on a billboard. Kennedy let the silence stretch. But you won't take it. You've been asked repeatedly. Reporters have asked. Constituents have asked. And you refuse every time. Why is that, ma'am? Kennedy asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. In my experience as a lawyer, and I've been doing this a long time, innocent people don't refuse tests that prove their innocence. They demand them. People who refuse those tests, well, they usually have a reason. And that reason usually isn't privacy. It's fear. Fear of what the result will show. He looked at her, his eyes piercing through the spectacle. You aren't refusing because it's racist, Ms. Omar. A DNA test can't be racist. It's just biology. You are refusing because you know the answer, and you are afraid the American people will find out too. Since we don't have a test, Kennedy said, opening his folder wider, let's talk about why folks are asking for one. Let's discuss the evidence that Ahmed Elmi is your brother. Because I've got 8 pieces of evidence here. Real documents. Real records. Not theories. Facts. Let me walk through them, Kennedy said, putting on his reading glasses. Maybe you can help me understand how all of this is just coincidence. He pulled out the first document with the care of an archaeologist handling a relic. Evidence number 1, the father's name. Your father's name, according to your own immigration records, is Nur Saeed Elmi Mohammed. Kennedy looked up. Now, Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi, the man you married, his full name breaks down like this. In Somali naming convention, the middle name is the father's name. It's a patronymic system. So, Ahmed's father is named Nur Saeed Elmi. Your father, Nur Saeed Elmi. His father, Nur Saeed Elmi. Kennedy looked over his glasses. That's the same person, ma'am. Now, maybe there are 2 different men, both named Nur Saeed Elmi, in Mogadishu. Maybe that's a common name like John Smith in Louisiana. But it seems like quite a coincidence that you and the man you married just happen to have the same father. He waited a beat. Omar stared ahead, stone-faced. Evidence number 2. School records. Kennedy held up copies of educational records, the ink faded, but legible. Before you came to America, you and Ahmed attended school together in Mogadishu. These are official school records from before any of this became controversial, before anyone was asking questions about Ilhan Omar. These records list you and Ahmed in the same family unit, same household, same address. The records identify you as brother and sister. Kennedy looked genuinely puzzled, scratching his head. Now, maybe the school made a mistake. Maybe the principal got confused. But nobody had any reason to lie back then. The school just wrote down what they were told. Brother and sister living in the same house. Help me understand, ma'am, Kennedy pleaded softly. If Ahmed isn't your brother, why would school records from your childhood list you as siblings? He didn't wait for an answer he knew wouldn't come. He moved to the third document. Evidence number 3. Social media. He held up printed screenshots, enlarged on poster board. Your relatives, people who knew you both in Somalia, people in your extended family. They referred to Ahmed as your brother on Facebook and Instagram multiple times. Kennedy read from the screenshots. One cousin wrote, "Congratulations to Ilhan and her brother Ahmed." Another posted, "Ahmed and Ilhan, brother and sister, both doing well in America." This was years ago, Kennedy noted, before you ran for Congress. Just family members naturally talking. Why would your own family call him your brother if he's not? Are they all part of the conspiracy, too? Did they plant these posts 10 years ago just to frame you today? Kennedy pulled out the 4th piece of evidence, a series of photographs. Evidence number 4, childhood photos. Pictures of you and Ahmed as children, in Somalia, together at family gatherings, in group photos, looking like siblings do. Kennedy laid the photos on the table, creating a visual timeline. "Now, ma'am," Kennedy said, leaning forward, "you have the same father's name. School records saying you are siblings. Family members calling you siblings on social media. Photos of you growing up together. I'm just a simple country lawyer, but when I see a duck, and it quacks like a duck, and it has webbed feet, I usually don't call it a chicken." All of this could be explained away, Kennedy reminded her, circling back to his trap. One DNA test. That's all it would take to prove these documents wrong. To prove your family members wrong. To prove the school wrong. To prove me wrong. But you won't take it. He paused, letting the weight of the visual evidence sink in. You see, Ms. Omar, coincidences happen. But 4 coincidences? All pointing to the exact same conclusion? That stops being a coincidence and starts looking like a pattern. And when you refuse the one thing that could disprove the pattern, it starts looking like the truth. Senator Kennedy did not rush. He let the weight of the first 4 pieces of evidence settle over the hearing room. The school records, the family photos, the social media posts. They had painted a picture of a brother and sister growing up together. Now, he needed to show the court and the cameras what their marriage actually looked like. He reached into his folder and pulled out a new stack of documents, these stamped with official government seals. Now, Ms. Omar, Kennedy said, adjusting his glasses, let's keep going, because the evidence doesn't stop with family photos. It gets a lot more technical, and frankly, a lot more troubling. Evidence number 5, where you lived. Kennedy held up 2 separate documents. One was a lease agreement, the other was a utility bill. You married Ahmed Elmi legally in 2009. That is a matter of public record. You stood before a judge or a clerk and swore you were husband and wife. But here is what is interesting to this old country lawyer. Kennedy leaned forward. You never lived with him. We pulled the records, ma'am. During the time you were legally married to Mr. Elmi, your residence, the place you slept, the place you got your mail, was the same address as Mr. Ahmed Hersey, your first partner and the father of your children. Mr. Elmi, your husband, lived at a completely different address, different street, different apartment. In fact, for a good chunk of your marriage, he lived in a different state. Kennedy looked at her with genuine confusion. Now, I've been married a long time, ma'am. And generally speaking, when people get married, they move in together. That's kind of the point. You share a life. You share a home. You share a toaster. But you and your legal husband lived apart from day one. You continued living with another man, Mr. Hersey, while you were married to Mr. Elmi. That doesn't look like a marriage to me, Kennedy drawled. That looks like a legal arrangement, a paper marriage, something done for official purposes, not because you were in love. He paused. Have you taken a DNA test to explain this unusual living arrangement? Because if he is your brother, it makes perfect sense why you wouldn't live with him as husband and wife. Kennedy moved seamlessly to the next document, his voice dropping an octave, becoming more serious. Evidence number 6, your tax returns. And ma'am, I want you to listen carefully here, because we are moving from strange behavior to potential federal crime. Kennedy held up IRS tax transcripts. The text was dense, but he pointed to the signature line. In 2014 and 2015, you filed joint federal tax returns with Ahmed Hersey. You signed your name. He signed his name. You filed as married filing jointly. There is just one problem, Kennedy said, taking off his glasses to look at her directly. You were still legally married to Ahmed Elmi during those years. You didn't divorce Elmi until 2017. Kennedy explained it like he was teaching a civics class. The federal tax code is clear, ma'am. You can only file a joint return with your legal spouse. You cannot file jointly with a boyfriend, or a partner, or a fiancé. You have to be married. So, you have a dilemma here. Kennedy held up 2 fingers. Option A. You committed tax fraud by filing jointly with Mr. Hersey when you were married to someone else. That is a felony. Option B. You committed tax fraud because you considered your marriage to Elmi to be fake. You thought of Hersey as your real husband because Elmi was your brother, so you filed with Hersey. But the law doesn't care about your feelings, it cares about the paperwork. Either way, Kennedy said, that is fraud. Tax fraud carries penalties of up to 3 years in prison and $100,000 in fines per return. You did it twice. That's 6 years and $200,000. He let the numbers hang in the air. A DNA test would clear this up. If Elmi isn't your brother, maybe this was just a messy administrative error. But you won't take the test. Kennedy pulled out the 7th piece of evidence. Evidence number 7. No relationship. Ma'am, when people get married, they leave a trail. There are photos of the wedding. There are witnesses. There are joint bank accounts. There are insurance policies. There are memories shared with friends. We have looked, Kennedy said, spreading his hands. We have looked everywhere. And with you and Ahmed Elmi, there is nothing. 0. No wedding photos. No friends who remember you as a couple. No joint finances. No shared property. It is like the marriage existed only in a filing cabinet in a county clerk's office. That is what fraud looks like, ma'am, when something exists on paper but not in reality. Kennedy reached for the final piece of evidence in this section. Evidence number 8. The motive. Now, folks watching might be wondering, why? Why would someone marry their brother? That sounds crazy, right? But to a lawyer, Kennedy said, it doesn't sound crazy. It sounds calculated, because there is a very clear motive. Immigration fraud. Kennedy walked through the logic. You came to America as a refugee. You became a citizen. Your immediate family, parents, minor children, they get status. But siblings, adult siblings, they don't automatically get the same benefits. The line is long. It takes years. But spouses, Kennedy snapped his fingers. Spouses get priority. Spouses get green cards. Spouses get student loans. Spouses get family reunification. If Ahmed was your brother and he wanted to study in the U.S., or he needed legal status, marrying him would be the fastest way to get it. It solves the problem instantly. That explains everything, Kennedy said. It explains why you married him but didn't live with him. It explains why you stayed with Mr. Hersey. It explains why the family called him your brother. It explains the lack of photos. Kennedy gathered the 8 documents into a neat stack and tapped them on the table. Let me summarize, ma'am. 1. Same father's name. 2. School records. 3. Family social media. 4. Childhood photos. 5. Separate residences. 6. Tax fraud. 7. No evidence of a relationship. 8. A clear motive. He looked at her with that patient grandfatherly expression. Now, I'm just a simple country lawyer. But when I see 8 pieces of evidence all pointing in the same direction, I tend to think there is fire where there is smoke. All 8 of these could be explained away with one simple test. A DNA test. 5 minutes of your time. So, let me ask you one more time, ma'am. Have you taken a DNA test? Omar stared back, her lips pressed into a thin line. She knew she couldn't answer. To say no was to admit fear. To say anything else was perjury. The silence stretched, louder than any shout. Senator Kennedy didn't wait for the non-answer. He accepted her silence as the confirmation it was. He opened a new folder, this one marked with red tabs. The atmosphere in the room shifted from investigative to judicial. Kennedy wasn't just asking questions anymore. He was reading the potential sentencing guidelines. I notice you won't answer simple questions, ma'am, Kennedy said softly. I ask yes or no questions, and you give speeches about Islamophobia. But I think we all understand what your silence means. So, let's talk about the consequences. Let's talk about why a DNA test scares you so much. He pulled out a thick law book, the spine cracked from use. He opened it to a bookmarked page. I want to discuss what happens if these allegations are true, because this isn't just about embarrassing headlines. This is about federal law. Crime number 1. Marriage fraud. Kennedy read from the statute. The Immigration and Marriage Fraud Amendments Act. It is a federal crime to enter into a marriage for the purpose of evading immigration laws. The penalty is up to 5 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000. He looked up. If you married your brother to help him get a student loan or a green card, that is 5 years, ma'am. Crime number 2. Tax fraud. We already discussed this, Kennedy said, holding up the tax transcript again. Filing jointly when you aren't married to that person. That's perjury on a government document. That is 3 years per return. You did it twice. That's another 6 years. Kennedy did the math on his fingers. So we are looking at 11 years, potentially. That is serious time. But then Kennedy's voice dropped, becoming grave. But there is something even more serious than prison, ma'am. Something that goes to the very heart of your status in this country. Denaturalization. The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. You are a naturalized citizen, Kennedy said. You swore an oath. You filled out paperwork. And on those forms, Form N-400, it asks if you have ever committed a crime for which you were not arrested. It asks if you have ever lied to a U.S. official to gain entry or an immigration benefit. If you married your brother, Kennedy reasoned, then you lied on your citizenship application. You lied about your family. You lied about your marriage. And under U.S. law, citizenship obtained through fraud can be revoked. Kennedy leaned in close to the microphone. Revoked, stripped, taken away. If you are denaturalized, you lose your status, you lose your seat in Congress, and you face deportation. Is that why you won't take the test? Kennedy asked, his voice filled with genuine pity. Is that why you are fighting so hard? Not because of privacy, not because of dignity, but because you know that a simple cheek swab could cost you your citizenship? He sat back, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. Refusing a DNA test. That is what lawyers call consciousness of guilt. It means you act like a guilty person because you know you are guilty. If you were innocent, you would be begging for that test. You would want to prove me wrong. You would want to rub my nose in it. You would want to hold up that paper and say, "See, Kennedy, you old fool, you were wrong." Kennedy smiled sadly. I would love to be proven wrong, ma'am. I really would. I would love for you to take that test and prove that all 8 pieces of evidence are just a giant coincidence. I will make you an offer right now, Kennedy said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out his wallet. It was an old leather wallet, worn at the edges. I will pay for it. I will pay for the DNA test out of my own pocket. I will arrange it for this afternoon. We can have a doctor come right here to the Capitol. 5 minutes. We seal the sample. We send it to a lab of your choosing. Will you do it? Kennedy held his wallet in his hand, waiting. It won't cost you a dime. It will only cost you the truth. Omar looked at the wallet, then at Kennedy. Her expression was frozen. To accept was to destroy herself. To refuse was to admit guilt to the entire world. I am not going to participate in your charade, Senator, she finally hissed. Kennedy put his wallet away slowly. It's not a charade, ma'am. It's an opportunity, and you just turned it down. That tells me everything I need to know, and I think it tells the American people everything they need to know. Kennedy closed the law book with a heavy thud. You are risking prison and deportation to hide the truth. That is a heavy burden to carry. Kennedy cleared the table of the marriage and tax documents. He took a sip of water, reset his reading glasses, and opened a new folder, this one even thicker than the last. Ms. Omar, we've talked about your past, Kennedy said. Now I want to talk about your present. I want to talk about how you handle money. Other people's money. Because if there is one pattern with you, ma'am, it is this. The men in your life seem to profit financially from your political position. Kennedy pulled out a stack of Federal Election Commission, FEC, reports. Let's talk about Tim Minot, Kennedy said. He is your current husband, but before he was your husband, he was your political consultant. I need to lay out a timeline so folks back home understand exactly what happened here. Because the timing matters. Kennedy began counting on his fingers again, his voice rhythmic and precise. 2018. You get elected to Congress. You hire a consulting firm called the E Street Group. That firm is run by Tim Minot. 2019. You start paying Mr. Minot's firm a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars. At the same time, reports start coming out that you are having an affair with Mr. Minot. Kennedy looked over his glasses. Now, I don't care about your personal life, ma'am. That's between you and God. But I care about the money. At this time, Mr. Minot was married. You were still married to Ahmed Hirsi. In July 2019, Mr. Minot's wife files for divorce. In the court filing, a public document, she explicitly states that her husband told her he was leaving her for you. August 2019. You file for divorce from your husband. March 2020. You marry Tim Minot. Kennedy paused. So, you hired him. You paid him. You had an affair with him. You married him. And throughout all of this, before, during, and after, you kept writing checks to his company from your campaign account? Kennedy held up a summary sheet. From 2018 through 2021, your campaign paid Tim Minot's firm $2.8 million. He repeated the number, enunciating every syllable. $2.8 million. That is a lot of money, ma'am. That is a fortune. Kennedy picked up a comparison chart. I looked at other members of Congress, members in safe districts like yours. They pay maybe $50,000, maybe $100,000 for digital consulting. You paid millions. Why? Kennedy asked. What services was Mr. Minot providing that were worth 20 times the going rate? The FEC filings say digital consulting, fundraising consulting, and travel expenses. Travel expenses, Kennedy chuckled without humor. You were paying for your boyfriend, and later your husband, to travel with you using campaign donor money. Help me understand this, ma'am, because to a simple country lawyer, this looks like you were using campaign funds to fund your romantic relationship. Donors gave money because they believed in your cause. They thought that money would go toward yard signs and TV ads. Instead, it went into your husband's bank account. Kennedy pulled out a report from the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board. The Minnesota board investigated. They found you used campaign funds for personal travel. Not campaign travel. Personal. They fined you. You paid the fine. You repaid the money. But you never admitted wrongdoing. But the federal money, the $2.8 million, that's the big pot. You paid over $2 million to the man you were sleeping with. Then you married him. And you don't see a conflict of interest there? Kennedy leaned back, looking at the ceiling as if asking for divine patience. This looks like corruption, ma'am. Pure and simple. This looks like using your campaign as a personal bank account. This looks like running a family business. And you know what I notice? Kennedy said, his eyes narrowing. It's a pattern. Ahmed Hersi, your first husband. He received campaign payments for consulting. Ahmed Elmi, your brother husband. He received immigration benefits from your marriage. Tim Minot, your current husband. He received $2.8 million. Every single man connected to you benefits financially or legally from your political position. That is not public service, Ms. Omar, Kennedy said, his voice hard. That is profiteering. You preach about socialism. You preach about the evils of capitalism. You attack the wealthy. But you are becoming wealthy using other people's money. Did you use campaign money to benefit your personal relationship with Tim Minot? Kennedy asked, returning to his favorite tactic. Yes or no? Omar opened her mouth to speak, likely to cite FEC regulations that technically allow hiring family members. And don't tell me it's legal, Kennedy cut her off. Lots of things are legal that are wrong. It is legal to be mean to your mother, but it's not right. Did you ethically use that money? Or did you enrich your husband? I think the numbers speak for themselves, Kennedy answered for her. $2.8 million speaks very loudly. Kennedy stacked the financial documents neatly. The hearing room was silent, save for the hum of the ventilation. He adjusted his tie and pulled out a new sheet of paper, a printout of a tweet. Ms. Omar, he said, his voice shifting from the forensic tone of the money discussion back to the moral weight of the earlier questions. I want to talk about some things you've said, statements you've made, because I want to understand what you meant. He held up the first printout. It was enlarged, the text clear for everyone in the room to see. February 10th, 2019. You tweeted about AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, a pro-Israel lobbying group. Someone asked why you thought politicians support Israel, and you responded with this. Kennedy read the tweet aloud, emphasizing the slang. It's all about the Benjamin's baby. And you added a music note emoji. When someone pressed you on who you thought was paying American politicians to support Israel, you replied with one word, AIPAC. Kennedy looked up over his reading glasses. Now, I may be just a country lawyer, but I know what all about the Benjamins means. That's a reference to the $100 bill. Benjamin Franklin. It means it's all about the money. And you were saying that American politicians only support Israel because Jewish organizations pay them to, that they are bought. Kennedy set the tweet down carefully. Ma'am, that is an anti-Semitic trope. The idea that Jews use money to control politics, that they buy influence, that they pull the strings behind the scenes with cash, that has been used to attack Jewish people for centuries. It's a classic stereotype. The greedy Jew. The manipulator. Even your own Democratic colleagues understood that, Kennedy noted. House Democrats, your own party, passed a resolution condemning anti-Semitism in direct response to your tweet. They were embarrassed. You apologized, sort of, Kennedy said, shrugging. Said you didn't know it was offensive. Said you were learning. But ma'am, you're a member of Congress. You have staff. You have advisors. And nobody told you that accusing Jews of buying political control might be anti-Semitic? Kennedy pulled out another tweet. November 16th, 2012. This is an earlier one, but it shows a pattern. During a conflict in Gaza, you tweeted, Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. Kennedy repeated the phrase slowly. Hypnotized the world. That is another anti-Semitic trope, ma'am. The idea that Jews have a mystical, demonic power to control minds, to deceive the world, to hypnotize people into doing their bidding. That is not policy criticism, Kennedy argued. That is medieval. That is the blood libel. That is the kind of language used to justify pogroms. You deleted that tweet eventually, Kennedy acknowledged, but you never really apologized for the sentiment. You defended it. He leaned forward. Now, here is what I don't understand. When people criticize you for these comments, you say it's not anti-Semitism. You say you are just criticizing the Israeli government. You say it's about policy. But ma'am, hypnotizing the world isn't policy. All about the Benjamins isn't policy. Those are stereotypes about a people. Kennedy then pivoted to his next point, a glint of irony in his eye. And then there is the dual loyalty charge. Multiple times, you have suggested that Americans who support Israel have dual loyalty, that they are loyal to Israel instead of America, that they can't be trusted. You questioned whether Jewish Americans can be loyal to this country. Kennedy shook his head. That is another classic attack, questioning the patriotism of Jews. But there is some irony here, Ms. Omar, Kennedy said, his voice hardening. You accused pro-Israel Americans of dual loyalty. But just recently, you gave a speech where you pledged to work for Somalia's interests, where you said Somalians in America should call the shots on U.S. government policy. So, you question other Americans' loyalty to this country, while openly saying you work for a foreign country? That's quite something, ma'am, Kennedy said. That's what we call projection. Kennedy set aside the tweets and picked up a transcript. His demeanor changed. The ironic detachment was gone. In its place was a simmering, controlled anger. Let's talk about something that made a lot of Americans angry, Kennedy said, including me. Let's talk about 9/11, and let's discuss what you said about it. He held up the transcript. March 23, 2019. You gave a speech to the Council on American-Islamic Relations, KIR. You were discussing Muslim civil rights in the wake of the attacks. And you said this. I'm quoting your exact words. Kennedy read slowly, letting each word hang in the air. KIR was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. Kennedy took off his reading glasses and stared at her. Some people did something. That is how you described 9/11, ma'am. The worst terrorist attack in American history. Nearly 3,000 Americans murdered. And you called it, some people did something. Kennedy's voice hardened. Let me tell you what actually happened on 9/11, because it wasn't some people, and it wasn't just something. 19 Islamic terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes. They murdered the pilots. They murdered the flight attendants. They slit throats with box cutters. They turned those planes into missiles. Kennedy began to list the facts, his voice rising in intensity. They flew American Airlines Flight 11 into the North Tower. 92 people on board. Murdered. They flew United Airlines Flight 175 into the South Tower. 65 people on board. Murdered. They flew American Airlines Flight 77 into the Pentagon. 64 people on board. Murdered. Passengers on United Flight 93 fought back. The plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. 44 people murdered. But they saved the Capitol. They saved this building we are sitting in right now. Kennedy leaned forward, his face flushed. 2,996 Americans murdered that day. Office workers trapped on the top floors, firefighters running into burning buildings while everyone else ran out, police officers, janitors, secretaries, people jumping from windows, holding hands, choosing to fall to their death rather than burn alive. First responders dying years later from the toxic air they breathed trying to save others. And you called it, "Some people did something." Kennedy shook his head in disgust. Ma'am, "some people did something" is what you say when someone forgets to return a library book. It's what you say when someone double parks. It is not what you say about mass murder. But that's what you said. In a speech about how Muslims lost civil liberties, you were more concerned about the consequences to your community than about the 3,000 people who were incinerated. You minimized the tragedy to make a political point. Kennedy looked at her. Did some people do something on 9/11? Or did Islamic terrorists murder 3,000 Americans? Which one is it? Omar attempted to speak, to claim she was taken out of context, that she was talking about the loss of rights. Kennedy cut her off. Ma'am, I read the whole speech. The context doesn't help you. The context is that you couldn't bring yourself to condemn the terrorists without pivoting to victimhood. You stripped the horror from the event because it didn't fit your narrative. That is what you did. Kennedy gathered his materials. He had one final topic, one final piece of evidence that tied everything together: the fraud, the money, the rhetoric. But there is one more thing we need to discuss, Kennedy said. Your most recent speech. The one where you told a room full of Somali Americans that you work for Somalia, not for America, not for Minnesota, for Somalia. So, let me ask you the most important question of this hearing, Kennedy said. Who do you work for? Do you work for the people of Minnesota's 5th District? Or do you work for the people of Somalia? He didn't wait for an answer. Because based on a speech you gave recently, it seems pretty clear you think you work for Somalia. Kennedy pulled out a video transcript. January 2024. You spoke to a Somali American audience in Minnesota. You spoke in Somali. And ma'am, what you said was shocking. Kennedy read from the transcript, emphasizing the key phrases. You said, the U.S. government will only do what Somalians in the U.S. tell them to do. You said, we Somalians must have that confidence in ourselves that we call the shots. You told the audience that your job as a congresswoman is to use your position to advance Somalia's interests. Kennedy set down the transcript and looked at her directly. Ma'am, you are a member of the United States Congress. You swore an oath to the Constitution of the United States. You represent Americans. You draw a salary from American taxpayers. But you stood in front of that audience and told them you work for Somalia, that Somalians in America should control what the U.S. government does, that you use your congressional position to benefit a foreign nation. His voice rose slightly. That is not dual loyalty, ma'am. That is foreign loyalty. That is putting another country's interests above America's. You are explicitly saying you represent Somalia, not Minnesota. Somalia, not America. Kennedy leaned back, looking at the ceiling. You know, we talked about anti-Semitism earlier. You accused Jews of having allegiance to Israel. But here you are, pledging allegiance to Somalia. Kennedy began his rapid-fire summary, ticking points off on his fingers. Let me go through everything we've established today. 1. Have you taken a DNA test to prove Ahmed Elmi isn't your brother? No. You refuse because you know what it would show. 2. Did you commit immigration fraud by marrying your brother? 8 pieces of evidence say yes. 3. Did you commit tax fraud by filing jointly with Hersey while married to Elmi? Your own tax returns prove yes. 4. Did you use campaign funds to enrich your boyfriend-turned-husband? $2.8 million in payments prove yes. 5. Did you make anti-Semitic statements using classic stereotypes? Your own tweets prove yes. 6. Did you minimize 9/11 by calling it "some people did something"? Your own speech proves yes. 7. Do you work for Somalia instead of America? Your own speech to Somali Americans proves yes. Kennedy's voice carried the weight of final judgment. Ms. Omar, you came to America as a refugee when you were 12 years old. This country took you in, gave you safety, gave you opportunities, gave you an education, gave you citizenship, gave you a path to Congress. This country gave you everything. And how have you repaid that generosity? By committing immigration fraud, by marrying your brother to get him benefits, by lying on official documents, by committing tax fraud, by using campaign funds to enrich your husband, by making anti-Semitic statements, by minimizing the worst terrorist attack in our history, by pledging your loyalty to Somalia instead of America. Kennedy's voice was quiet, but devastating. You are not fit to serve in the United States Congress. You are not fit to represent Americans because you don't work for Americans. You work for yourself. You work for Somalia. Every decision you've made has been about benefiting yourself, or your family, or your home country. Never about serving the Americans who elected you. Kennedy stacked the campaign finance documents on top of the marriage documents. The pile was high now, a physical tower of evidence sitting between him and the Congresswoman. He looked at Ilhan Omar with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. He had asked the questions. He had presented the evidence. Now, it was time for the verdict. Ms. Omar, Kennedy said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the silent room. I have no further questions for you. Your refusal to answer speaks louder than anything you could say. He turned to the committee chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have several recommendations for this committee and for the appropriate authorities. Kennedy adjusted his glasses one last time and read from a prepared list. First, I recommend the Department of Justice immediately investigate Congresswoman Omar for immigration fraud. The evidence that she married her brother is overwhelming. Her refusal to take a DNA test is damning. This is a federal crime, and it demands a federal prosecutor. Second, I recommend the IRS reopen an investigation into her tax returns for 2014 and 2015. Filing joint returns with a man you aren't married to is fraud. Period. Third, I recommend the Federal Election Commission launch a full audit of the $2.8 million paid to the E Street Group. We need to know if those funds were used for personal expenses disguised as consulting. Fourth, I recommend the House Ethics Committee investigate whether her pledge to serve Somalia violates her oath of office. Kennedy paused, looking back at Omar one last time. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I have a recommendation for the voters of Minnesota. You deserve better. You deserve a representative who will answer simple questions. You deserve a representative who doesn't have to hide her DNA. You deserve a representative who doesn't commit fraud. You deserve a representative who works for America. Ms. Omar is not that representative. Kennedy stood up. He gathered his yellow legal pads. He picked up his manila folder. He didn't look back at the Congresswoman. He simply walked out of the hearing room, his country lawyer work done. Behind him, Ilhan Omar sat in the glare of the television lights, silent and diminished. She had come in prepared for a fight, but she had been dismantled by the truth. The aftermath. What Senator John Kennedy exposed that day went beyond one Congresswoman's corruption. He revealed a troubling pattern of using refugee status and identity politics as shields against accountability. Ilhan Omar came to America as a 12-year-old refugee. She received the American dream. But instead of gratitude and service, she showed contempt and exploitation. The evidence remains. The 8 separate pieces of documentation regarding her marriage, the tax records, the campaign finance reports, the tweets, the speeches, and the simplest solution, a DNA test, remains untaken. Why? Because she knows what it would prove. Innocent people don't refuse tests that prove their innocence. They demand those tests. They volunteer for them. But Omar won't take it because she knows that test would confirm she committed immigration fraud. She filed joint returns with Ahmed Hirsi while legally married to Ahmed Elmi. That is black and white tax fraud. She paid $2.8 million to her husband's firm. That is profiteering. She minimized 9/11. She pledged loyalty to Somalia. Senator Kennedy exposed all of this with the simplest technique: asking questions and demanding answers. Yes or no questions. Simple, direct, impossible to evade without looking guilty. Have you taken a DNA test? No. Will you take a DNA test? No. Why won't you answer simple questions? Because the answers would prove guilt. The American people deserve representatives who answer questions, who take responsibility, who serve their constituents rather than foreign countries or personal interests. Ilhan Omar is not that representative. She is a fraud who exploited refugee status to come to America, then exploited her office for personal gain, then pledged her loyalty to a foreign country. The country lawyer from Louisiana asked simple questions. The evasive non-answers told us everything we need to know.